dirt carvers, bee swatters, and nail arters, Rusty has been dealing with some Hallownest withdrawals lately, and it's doing me a concern. How do you give Silksong the time it needs for a good release when you have the patience and attention span of an insomniatic bird? Well, find other games to keep you busy, of course. So I've been looking around lately, and while I've found more than a few handfuls of metroidvania videos just by themselves, video essays, reviews, and whatnot, videos talking about games that may appeal specifically to Hollow Knight fans kind of seem to be a little sparse, at least in the video content area. But I want to keep things fresh and exciting. I don't want to just give you 5 random metroidvanias I dug up on a Steam sale and throw them into some boring, uninspired Watch Mojo-esque list. Just because a game is a 2D metroidvania platformer doesn't mean it's going to unequivocally appeal to anyone, bar none, that has ever played Hollow Knight. In fact, some of the games I put on here aren't even two-dimensional at all. So if you're like me and you're suffering from cornifer withdrawals, just know that it does get better and I'm here for you. Now, let's get going. Sundered by Thunder Lotus Games is a chaotic hand-drawn side-scroller that puts you against hordes and swarms of terrifying beasts, creatures, and eldritch nightmares that look like they were pulled from the mind of Lovecraft himself. It's basically what you would end up getting if someone ate a chapter of the Necronomicon with a hearty helping of Cthulhu on the side, washed it down with a glass of Pixar, and shit out whatever the hell this is. Sundered is identified as a procedurally generated metroidvania, and if you got a headache hearing me say that out loud, well then don't worry, because so did everyone else. Thankfully, the procedural generation is pretty limited. While the layouts of the levels themselves are randomized whenever you die, the order in which you access the levels stay the same pretty much every run. The navigation can be sort of confusing, but it still has enough linearity to be able to call itself a Metroidvania. It's got impossibly giant bosses that you can take down, hordes of snakes and demons ready to rip your unsuspecting ass apart and make you their eldritch bitch, and a legendary music score that blows my fucking balls off even 3 years later. Not a lot of people like this game, and I can kinda understand why. The gigantic bosses are actually one of the largest drawbacks of the game. Really huge bosses also means that the camera has to zoom out much further than necessary and reduce your character to a useless looming speck of dust that you can barely see. I don't want to spoil too much, but one of the first boss fights actually had me squinting at the screen trying to find out where the hell I was half the time, because he was so damn huge that the camera had to travel miles away to where I could barely see what I was even doing just so they could fit his fat ass on the fucking screen. But what attracted me to Sundered wasn't its combat, but it was rather the enemy and the sound design. Two of the first things that also attracted me to playing Hollow Knight. And you know, my hours on Sundered versus my hours on Hollow Knight aren't even close to comparable, but it is a good time waster and it was more than enough to keep me busy for a few days. The enemy and boss design is pretty badass, and I think the soundtrack alone is more than worth the purchase. Code Vein is an action RPG developed and published by Bandai Namco, set in a dystopian society that isn't even fucking out yet. Rusty, what the hell's wrong with you? Why is this even on the list? Well, despite the game not even being out yet, the fact that its reins are being held tightly by the same company responsible for some of the most prolific titles ever, including the publishing of the Dark Souls series, is, I think, more than enough to at least warrant a glance. From what we know about it so far, dystopian themes and motifs are going to be pretty heavily anchored in Code Vein. The gameplay looks pretty sick, and the hopelessly gloomy and dystopian setting could potentially appeal to players that also enjoyed Hollow Knight for that reason. The combat system involves perks called gifts that you can use to fortify certain abilities and weapons and such, and there are apparently dozens of these. For a game where the fundamental objective is swinging a sword and killing things, it's got customization out the ass. And I think that's another reason Hollow Knight fans might consider giving this a glance. Part of the reason why I kept finding replay value in Hollow Knight was that the charm system either gave you unique abilities or buffed the ones you already had. It's a system that seems very simple and straightforward on the surface, but the more time you spend fooling around and collecting charms and experimenting, the more you realize it's actually anything but simple. And to my knowledge, and from what I've read, the customization in Code Vein kinda seems to fulfill this description pretty well. It's the type of customization that seems simple starting off, but it ramps up quickly in complexity as you continue. You can also overlap multiple hairstyles and the character creation, and that has nothing to do with anything, but it sounds fucking funny, so I wanted to mention it. So there you go. Ashen is an open-world RPG that has more than a couple of times fallen victim to being swept up under the label of the soul genre. And I think that kinda sucks, because despite the striking similarities in combat, the art style, exploration, and atmosphere of the game are all pretty distinguishable from others like it. Another paramount reason why I enjoyed Hollow Knight came from the scale of the quest you were on. It's the excitement of seeing what you thought to be a simple 2D platformer slowly unravel into this giant rabbit hole that you just can't help but explore. And although Ashen sometimes feels like it's struggling to find its identity among other games, one thing it definitely seems to share with Hollow Knight is an affinity for adventure. Small tunnels that seem insignificant will sometimes give way to massive underground tombs and caverns full of loot and cool stuff to find, or, you know, a fucking boss. Damn, it's one of those games where you can just casually step into a foreign space and get a nice warm welcome from a gang of enemies that are all 5 times tougher than you are. Well, shit, no one told me I wasn't supposed to go here, so damn. The soundscapes and level design do a really good job painting up this grim and lonely world where you feel less like some superhero on an important quest and more like a wandering intruder in this unfamiliar land where everything is just trying to kill you. And a lot of times this was kind of how I felt in Hollow Knight. Half of the areas and biomes in the game I ended up finding by sheer accident because I just got curious and decided to run in one direction and not stop until I hit something. And that something would just happen to be a nice serifed text box greeting me into another part of the game. It's a type of exploration where the more you play, the larger the magnitude of your journey seems to become. It's a very rare kind of excitement that I usually don't find in a lot of games anymore. But the only 2 indie games I've played in at least the past 3 years or so that were able to nail this atmosphere exceptionally well were Hollow Knight and Ashen, so if that's your thing, then please give it a look. Dust is probably the oldest game I'm going to mention on here. It saw a release back in 2012, just a year before the coming in of a new wave of consoles that would end up lending massive support and spotlight to smaller developers. This was a really weird point in time where every indie dev company had that game. There was a ubiquity, just like a non-stop waterfall of these cartoonishly animated metroidvania hack-and-slash platformers, and it seemed like it got to where creating one of these became almost sort of a rite of passage that identified you as a capable dev team. Basically, if you called yourself an indie development company in 2012 and didn't have one of these games, you were kinda just brushed aside. That is, of course, ignoring the horror boom of the early 2010s, however. And because the market was just so saturated with hack-and-slash platformers, Dust was a game that stood out for like a week and then sort of just flew back under the radar. Dust is a criminally underrated game with lots of cool animation, really satisfying combat, the controls are tight, and I'm not gonna say great voice acting, but it's better than you would expect this kind of game to have. It's a game that's just got a lot going on, and I don't say that as a criticism at all. The level design and navigation of Dust was probably what kept this game from getting too old for me. The eye-catching sword tricks and stylized combat were more than enough to get me interested, but the comfort of navigating in between levels and just admiring the work that went into some of the background scenery I think was what kept me around for a longer time than most. And likewise, Hollow Knight receives praise for its tight controls and responsive combat, but a thing that often goes underappreciated, I think, is just the level design itself. The navigation feels effortless and very comfortable, and it's kind of one of those things where people seldom notice when the job is done correctly, yet bad level design is probably one of the easiest flaws to pick up on. In addition to creating a vibrant world with sentient animals, Dust is also one of the only 3 games I know of that features a talking sword, the others being Transistor and DMC3. Hades is a dungeon crawler made by Supergiant Games, the same company behind successful IPs like Transistor, Bastion, and Pyre. Its early access was released at the tail end of last year, but I wouldn't let that turn you off from playing it because it's probably one of the most polished early access builds I think I've ever seen. I've given you reasons to try out the other games I've brought up, but honestly, I think all I would really have to do here to sell the appeal of Hades is to just tell you who made it and what they've worked on in the past. Bastion was a huge favorite for me when it came out, and even more so with Transistor 3 years later. Hades, however, is not a territory they're familiar with, because this is actually the first roguelite on Supergiant's discography. While the layouts and enemy spawns are completely randomized, most of the upgrades you get are permanent, and can be used to further the progress of your quest to the end. A lot of this results in making slow and steady strides toward the end, and advancing just slightly past the area you got killed in last time, or shaving just a little more off the boss's health bar far before eventually dying again and trying again. And those upgrades build and build with each run until you're finally able to break down that wall and make significant progress. And getting past an extremely difficult boss or triumphing through what seems like an almost impossible fight is what Hollow Knight does really well. The magnitude of some of these fights just feel big, and since you aren't given that many clear indications of a boss's health level, it can sometimes feel like you're just constantly throwing yourself at this big boss dude and lasting just a little while longer than you did your last attempt. Granted, the exploration in Hades is a tad limited, and the concept of what you're supposed to be doing is pretty straightforward, but that's not really what the game is about. It's a mindless hack and slash roguelite that has a surprisingly cool story behind it, so if that's your thing, and if you specifically liked Hollow Knight for its difficulty, then I would suggest keeping an eye on this one. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. I'm Rusty, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, and I get the hell out of here.